This lecture will be on historical narratives. In order to talk about historical narratives, I think it might help to refer to what has been called the 5 C's of historical thinking, right? These are in a sense a kind of a list of 5 things that begin with C that historians do. So one thing that historians do, of course, is to look at change over time, right? One definition I give of history when I'm teaching 201 is to think about history as studying how things have changed over time and the causes for that change, right? So historians, and it's kind of funny because people will sometimes say, history, it's easy to study because it doesn't change. But in fact, we focus on change, and often our understandings of historical events change as we understand over time the ramifications those events had. Another thing we do is we look at context, right? We don't want to be guilty of anachronism. We don't want to look back at a historical time period, for example, and assuming the knowledge that we have that people in the past could not have had, right? We don't want to assume that. So we need to understand the context. We need to understand what forces are shaping people in those time periods. If we don't, we're not going to understand why they acted the way they did, and it will make them often, their action seems irrational, right? If we don't understand what they were reacting to, what their environment was like, we can't understand why they were acting. Kind of going back to this issue of change over time, we also look at causality, right? How did the environment shape people? How did it give them certain choices, and why did they make the choices they did, and how did that affect things, right? We're looking at what caused things and the effect of those causes. And one thing I want to stress, though, historians recognize contingency, right? We recognize contingency. There's a famous case in a Civil War battle, I believe it was Antietam, where a Union officer discovered a copy of the Confederate battle plans that a Confederate officer had carelessly dropped. I believe he was using it to wrap his cigars, right? That's not something you could simply predict. People have free will, and I would argue that sometimes things are just surprising. The universe is a curious place, and so sometimes there's things that just are there, and free will is one of those things that we just really can't, I think, completely understand. That's something that I guess psychologists and people are looking more into. But the key thing is people make decisions, right? We're shaped by historical factors, but we're still free agents in a sense. We still can make decisions, and we have to keep that in mind, right? That people do make choices. And finally, the last C is this issue of complexity, right? We try and understand things complexly, as they like to say on Crash Course, right? Historians are famous, I think, for when people will say, oh, why did this happen? We'll start off, well, there were multiple causes. And that's usually how things work. There are multiple causes. And I would argue that trying to get people to think about these issues of complexity and how it impacts human behavior is actually one of the major roles of historians, right? People often look for very simple reasons, and we'll just dismiss, oh, why do these people think different from me politically or religiously or socially? Well, they're bad people. They're haters. They're prejudiced. They're whatever. They're old-fashioned, whatever. But if we actually take the time to think about why they might think that way, we can still disagree with them, but we can still have a kind of respect that would allow us to work together, to live together, to compromise, right? And so it's key, I think, for us to also understand things complexly to help people to think more about that, right? But that, in a sense, was just background information. To what end are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Right? What's the story we're trying to tell? And you can think about this. What drives the stories you tell or want to tell about the past? Why did you get into history? Right? And one thing that I think makes history so interesting is basically history is stories. We tell stories about the past that help us to better understand that past and its impact on the present. Right? So a big question we have to ask ourselves is, why are we telling these stories? What is it we're trying to do, right? And this goes to this fascinating phrase, I think, a usable past, right? Again, why do we pick the stories that we want to tell? Why do we study a particular type of history or a particular time period? There's lots of different reasons, but for some reason, we usually pick a period of time that resonates with us, right? There's some reason why we find this history evocative, why we find it fascinating, why we're passionate about it. It's important to understand why, right? And usually we somehow think that this past could be helpful to people living in the present, right? We think this past can be somehow helpful to people living in the present, right? It can help guide our action, right? If we understand how some people acted in the past and how that affected things, and we see a parallel situation in our time period, then it makes sense to apply it, right? And the example I like to give, because I think it's just a classic example, is the Americans who were colonialists, who were fighting for independence and who were trying to build eventually a new government. They knew that in the past, Greece and Rome had democracy. Rome had been a republic. So they knew that you could do it. But they also knew that the democracies had eventually fallen. The Roman Republic had been replaced by a dictatorship. And so they studied the past to try and understand how to build a democracy that would have the strengths of those democracies in the Roman Republic without having the weaknesses and without following, right? So it helped guide action, right? So you may have particular social or political concerns, and you think something about the past can help us better to understand those present day concerns. That's something a lot of historians do. And as long as we're careful and good historians, that's something we should be doing because we're making the past relevant. We're finding a usable past. Another aspect is inspiration. I often, again, talk about this in world history class. I pick inspiring figures. I love Socrates, right? This man who chose to pursue virtue and truth even at the cost of his own life. I think that's inspiring. Now, we have to be careful about this because it's easy just to enter into hero worship and to not, learn about or understand the person, right? And understand especially their faults or their flaws or whether they're mistaken. And that's kind of the key difference between a good historian is that they can recognize that and a bad historian who can't. In addition, history often gives us a sense of identity and meaning, right? So when you take U.S. history class in high school, for example, there's a kind of understanding, this is our history. This is our American history. We're Americans, and this is what it means to be an American, right? So we often find identity and meaning through history, right? And this can help build community, right? Can help build community, right? We, these American people, right? Now, there are also some issues with this, though. Again, we have to be careful because, again, a good historian realizes we have to learn from the past. So they may engage in some constructive criticism, right? So, okay, yes, the United States, we've done some good things, but we also have to recognize we've done some bad things. And we have to understand why those bad things, why Americans did those bad things so we can avoid it in the future, right? That's what a good historian would do. A bad historian would just say, oh, U.S. always right, never makes a mistake, we're awesome, right? Now, we can still be awesome and make mistakes. But the key thing here is that this is kind of what we have to be careful about. We tell stories about the past, right? We have to put all the information we're finding, all the data we're finding into a story. And typically these stories are meant to be somehow useful for us today, right? They can help guide action. They can inspire us. They can give us a sense of identity and meaning around which we can build a healthy community. So to kind of summarize then, historians tell stories about the past that are accurate, complex, and useful if we do our job correctly. If we allow bias, right? If we allow bias to overtake us, then we will tell deformed stories, wrong stories about the past that will mislead people. Now, we all have bias. That's why we work together as a community, though, to try and balance that out. So someone could say, you know what, Dr. Rausch, I think you're kind of off about this. I think you're not being critical enough of this group. I think you're being too critical of this group, right? That's why we have a scholarly community. So we always have to be reflecting. We have to make sure that the love for a community which we belong to does not cause us to hide its faults, right? We want to make sure that the stories we tell about the past are accurate, complex, and are therefore useful. Now, this can be very difficult, right? This can be complex because not only does it have to do with kind of overcoming our own inherent biases, it also can lead us to challenge things, right? To challenge ways people have understood history. So to give you an example, in 1994, the Smithsonian had an exhibit on the Enola Gay, right? The bomb, B-29 bomber that dropped the first nuclear bomb, and that bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. And the exhibit, I've studied some about it. I'd like to look more at it in the future, but it seemed to me like a fairly historically accurate exhibit. It tried to put into context why the Americans dropped the bomb. it did not shy away from showing the carnage of the bomb. And a large number of American veteran groups were upset at this and protested against it. And in the end, I believe the head of the Smithsonian was essentially lost his job. I believe he was forced to resign. And this is a difficult case because on one side, we have to remember, if you were a U.S. Marine in 1945 who just fought in Okinawa, you thought you were going to go invade Japan. You thought you were going to die. And then suddenly these bombs are dropped and and Japan surrenders and you no longer have to invade. And so any kind of challenging or questioning of that decision to drop the bomb, you take that really personally. And especially if it comes from, scholars who have pretty comfortable lives. And like I said, you just fought on Okinawa and you have memories of your buddies dying on Okinawa. Again, this is going to be upsetting and make you angry. And so this led to a major debate. And in the end, the exhibit was significantly altered so as to avoid offending the veteran groups and their supporters. Now, again, I'm just mentioning this in very brief detail here, just to show you the difficulties. That in a sense, you also have to be very careful about how you do this. It's a lot safer now to do this because, unfortunately, a lot of the veterans have passed away and they're no longer politically active. So now you can kind of challenge this, but I don't think the people putting this exhibit together realized how, an academic understanding of this would make a lot of people angry. And you really have to judge your own position and decide just where you can go, what you can talk about, and how direct you can be, right? You have to be very, very careful about that. And in a sense, you have to pay your dues before you can say things like this, right? And sometimes you might have a good message, but you might not be the right person to say it. I think a veteran who was a scholar would find it much easier. I'm not saying it would be easy, but it would be easier to challenge that than someone like me who's never been in the military. But those are things also to think about when you're choosing your subject and when you're telling your stories. Now, I want to give you some examples of historical narratives and explain how they can be things that people find attractive because they are able to explain the world, they're able to give a sense of meaning and identity and all those things, but how they also have problems, right? And I'm going to give you multiple examples, and I hope that can help us to kind of reflect and be careful about the narratives we're giving, so we can give the best possible ones. But I'm going to start with a couple ones about American history at first. And the first is what I would call conservative history of the United States. And usually a conservative history of the United States would say, at some point, the U.S. reached a sort of golden age. And a lot of times this would be put, say, in the 1950s. But some sort of decline occurred that has led America astray, right? Something happened after the 1950s, right? And often what happened is understood in moral terms, right? Americans became less patriotic, they became less religious. Something happened and America has gone astray. And we need to recover that something to get back to that golden age. Americans need to be more patriotic, they need to be more religious or something like that, and then things will get better, right? And that's a very simple understanding of history, but it is an attractive view for many people. But there's some blind spots, right? Who benefited in this golden age? And if you think of the 1950s as a golden age, then chances are you're a white male, right? Because that was a time period when things were very good for white men, right? But not for all, of course, but just more generally. But of course, if you're African American, things are a little bit different, right? When you think back to the 50s, that's when the civil rights movement has kind of been renewed, but it still has a lot of work to do, right? And so sometimes, I think this easily leads to kind of misunderstandings, both of history and in terms of politics, right? Because here you can see how a story about the past directly impacts American politics, right? So you just want to reflect, right? Is this the kind of story I tell? And if it is, how accurate is it, right? Who is it excluding? Who is it including? In contrast, you also have what I would call a liberal progressive history of the United States, which understands not so much a golden age that happened in the past that we need to recover, but an idea that the United States had a promise of liberty, but it was very limited, right? Again, it only applied to white males. And American history has been the expansion of liberty and freedom over time to more and more people, right? So they would say, the United States started off with a lot of promise, but it's taken a long time to enact that promise, right? And I believe Dr. Martin Luther King, in one of his speeches, he referred to how a check had been written, but it hadn't really gone through yet, right? There had been this promise of freedom, but African Americans were still waiting for it, right? And so in this liberal progressive history of the United States, we start off with a big promise, but there's problems with how that promise of freedom was enacted. And right over time, more and more people have gotten that freedom. And there's this idea that this needs to keep going. We need to maximize personal autonomy as much as possible, right? So that's another kind of American history perspective that often goes to people who are on the left wing rather than the right wing, as we saw in the previous one. Now, as a historian, I would argue that this also has some blind spots. It often misses that people could find meaning in older ways of life, and often misses the logic behind those arrangements, right? And so can be dismissive, I think, of people in the past, and like, oh, those people, they were just haters, or they were just prejudiced, and they're just not as enlightened as people are today. And I'm always wary of anything that kind of just emphasizes how awesome we are, I guess. But in any case, you can see how this could also lead to blind spots. Both the conservative and liberal views can lead to blind spots that dismiss the experiences of other people. And as historians who are dedicated to trying to be complex, we need to make sure that we can capture those experiences, including with people that we disagree with, right? I mean, if you follow more on the conservative view, you need to do a better job. And this includes myself, whatever view I fall under, I'm including myself. We all need to do a better job. But, if you fall under the conservative view, you need to probably do a better job of including people who are in those blind spots. If you're in the liberal progressive view, you also have blind spots. You need to work on including those people. Now, there are problems with both of these perspectives and just any kind of narrative, right? They can easily lapse into a kind of simplistic praise and blame, right? I like this person. Their politics agree with me. Their social views agree with me. So they're awesome. And they did nothing wrong. Or alternately, this person is like the worst person ever. They're against everything I stand for. They couldn't possibly have supported anything. Anyone who supported them, must have been a hater, right? They must have had this kind of irrational prejudice, and that's why they supported them, or something like that, right? And this can also, like I said, lead easily to ignoring important historical figures. And I want to share with you something that was happened in when I was an undergraduate. And one thing that was interesting was we had these student bulletin boards, and someone put together a student bulletin board on Women's History Month, and it included famous women from throughout the world. And what was kind of a concern for me as I looked closely at the bulletin board was that it only included women on the political left. And even women who were more center politically, they had to actually include captions that explained why they were still okay for progressives to support, right? So they had to justify women who were not women who were closer to the center. They had to justify why they were there. And I was like, wait a second, this isn't Women's History Month. This is Feminist History Month. And that's very different. And if you want to label something Feminist History Month, that's okay from my perspective. But don't say it's Women's History Month when it ignores a lot of women. So to give you a concrete example, it didn't include Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, I think she would be a very important person to include because she was the first woman prime minister of Great Britain, or I should say England rather, right? That's impressive, I think, right? And that's something I think Americans could aspire to. I mean, at the time of this recording, we have never had a woman president, right? She seems to me to be someone who would be perfect to include in an American exhibit for Women's History Month. She was the longest serving English prime minister in the 20th century, and she had the nickname the Iron Lady because she was really tough. Right? So she entered into a very masculine, in a sense, patriotic world of politics and did that job effectively. And, many people thought she did well. But because she was on the wrong political side, right? She was on the right rather than the left, she was excluded, right? And as historians, we just can't do that, right? Historians, we have to make sure that we're telling the story complexly, and that we don't just eliminate people because we don't like them or their politics or their social views. We have to be willing to look at these people as objectively as possible. And in reverse, we can't just praise people simply because they happen to agree with us. right? That's a great way to bring in stagnation if we just only listen to people who agree with us and we ignore people who don't. So those are just some ways that Americans see history, that American history. We now need to see a little bit about how Americans might view Korean history, right? Now, one that kind of drives me nuts is the Korea, the Forgotten War. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, this would work, but I just don't see it as a forgotten war, considering how many books are about it, right? And how we talk about it all, what seems to me to be quite a bit. So I think we're past the Forgotten War. There might have been some time when it's appropriate to start off an article, Korea is the Forgotten War, no longer. But there's also a patriotic American view that understands American intervention as having saved Korea, and by that I mean South Korea, and prevented it from becoming just like North Korea, right? So there's this idea that, South Korea would be just like North Korea if we hadn't intervened. That's questionable, but it could happen. I'm not sure. But this view tends to emphasize how American efforts were inherently positive and good, and anything that was negative was just kind of incidental. In contrast, you have the Korea as prelude to Vietnam American perspective, which basically says, Korea was just kind of a rehearsal for the American intervention in Vietnam. Both wars were wrongful and destructive examples of American influence overseas, right? And so this view, and it tends to be especially, I think, held by Americans who lived through the Vietnam War, who were on the political left and who see the Vietnam War as just really terrible. And so they tend to read that back into Korea and say, this is kind of what got us into Asia, and this is what got us into this anti-communist crusade that led to Vietnam, and the Vietnam War, maybe killed some friends of mine, right? And I'm emphasizing that to see, you can see the emotion there, right? That impacts us. And again, the patriotic American view, this is going to be more likely held by Americans who fought in the war. And there is a generation of Korean scholars, people studying Korea, who are veterans, right? And they're going to have more likely in some cases to have that view. And again, there's nothing wrong with trying to argue this in a sense if the data supports you, right? You can argue that the Korean American influence in Vietnam or Korea was eventually harmful, or you can argue that it was inherently good. You would just need to be sure to define your terms, and you would have to be sure to actually look at all the available evidence, which is, by the way, why you wouldn't do it for this paper, because you can't do that. My key point is not that you can't hold these ideas, but you have to hold them complexly. You have to also look at the counter evidence and things like that. But it's important not to hold these ideas in this kind of simplistic form. You have to expand it to deal with the evidence. Now, it's not just, of course, Americans who have certain stories that we like to tell. Of course, Koreans also have their own stories, right? And one story, first of all, that Koreans had to deal with was the Japanese colonial story. And the Japanese colonial story went like this. Koreans are incapable of reform, right? They can't reform. And they always have to rely on stronger states. They used to rely on China, but now China is weak, China is backwards, so we Japanese need to take over. And of course, this justifies the colonial period, right? So there's this Japanese historians who argued that Koreans are stagnant, they can't reform, they always rely on a stronger state to protect them. Now, they do this by reading the story incorrectly. And one thing that in particular they do is they miss how Japan thwarted Korean attempts at reforms. There were Koreans who did try and reform Korea, but the Japanese would mess it up, right? So they don't see how they themselves created this situation. And in a sense, this is problematic because it blinded them to what they were doing. And if you take this perspective today, it makes you miss how, right, you can engage in counterproductive activities, right? Japan could have done things very differently in Korea and helped Korea and help themselves. But instead, they followed this policy of colonizing Korea, treating the Koreans very badly. That eventually leads to World War II and the destruction of much of Japan and many Japanese people. Koreans reacted to this by arguing we were on the way to becoming modern, but the process was interrupted by outside interference, i.e. the Japanese and other imperialist powers. This tends to overemphasize Korean advances towards modernization. Like I'm familiar with this. I've read it a lot. And this tends to overemphasize what Koreans were doing. But it is correct in pointing out that Koreans were more dynamic than this Japanese colonial perspective looked at. And the problem is because the Japanese colonial perspective was so strong, when the Koreans responded, in a sense, to counter it, they tended to overemphasize these Korean advances towards modernization. And what's interesting, too, then, is that Korean Christian narratives, remember, I focus especially on Catholicism in Korea, though Protestants do this too, they want to show how Christianity, especially their own brand of Christianity, either Protestant or Catholic, contributed to the development of Korean modernization and is therefore good for the nation. Right? So they say, yes, we Koreans were on the way to modernization, and our Christian group was on the pioneering side of that. So, for example, you might look at, if you're a Korean Protestant Christian, you're going to emphasize the late 19th and early 20th century when American missionaries and British missionaries were helping Koreans to learn more about the modern world, and how, churches, for example, Presbyterian churches, which basically in a Presbyterian church you have elders who are chosen by the community, and those elders choose the ministers. They would argue, this is a kind of training ground for democracy. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? So this isn't wholly false. None of these are completely false. Sometimes they just go too far. The Japanese colonial one I find particularly problematic, but none of them are 100% completely false. Now, this Korean Christian one, though, it's problematic, I think, because it, of course, tends to overemphasize Korean advances towards modernization, especially when carried out by Christians. But it tends to only focus on Christian figures and movements that are directly related to this. So, for example, in Catholicism, there's this tendency to focus on how Korean Catholics are being exposed to modern Western knowledge through these reading books by Western missionaries. And that's true, but when you focus so much on that, you miss the fact that most Korean Catholics were not doing that, right? Most were not doing that, and this was actually only a small group of scholars who were exposed to these modern ideas. And in a sense, so for example, the women who often made up the heart of the movement, if I recall correctly, most of the martyrs were actually women. They're kind of ignored in this view. And that's, again, a problem, right? If we focus too much on modernization, we miss this other group of people who were very important. Now, to give you another example that you might run into, these are some examples from a Korean perspective. This is after the Korean War, right? And so many South Koreans, right, will say, our country was devastated by the Korean War, but through hard work and determination, Koreans were able to develop a wealthy and independent country. Now, there's a lot of truth to that. Koreans had to work very hard, right? And it was common because people would call this in the time period the miracle in the Han. This is talking about the Han River that goes through Seoul, because Seoul was able to go from a city that had been devastated in the Korean War to be this kind of metropolis. And some Koreans were really offended because they said, there's no miracle. We worked hard to do this. And that's very true. However, there's a tendency to miss how much of this was based on American aid and the aid from other countries. The amount of foreign aid given to the United States, either directly or in loans and things like that to the South Korean government, was astounding. And simply to tell this story of the Koreans lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps is not completely true. It's not completely false. They did have to work hard. But they also benefited in many ways from American assistance, right? And it's problematic if they miss that part of the story. And sometimes it's kind of frustrating because, I've talked to Koreans who will really kind of criticize other countries and say, well, we became independent on our own and we became wealthy on our own, so why didn't they? And it's like, well, they're not getting as much assistance, right? It's complex. Now, unfortunately, and then the kind of the opposite is, even though South Korea, we became a wealthy and independent country, unfortunately, because of outside forces, the Korean nation was divided, and that division still exists. And that makes the opposite mistake, right? The first one tends to overemphasize Korean causes, right? We Koreans worked hard and through our determination made our country wealthy. The other one, right, this one that focuses on division focuses on outside people. If it weren't for those Americans, if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, Korea would not still be divided. And this misses the internal causes for division, that Koreans really were divided over whether Korea should try and look more like the United States or whether it should look more like the Soviet Union. And there could be real progress towards unification tomorrow, except for the North Korean government does not want unification because it would mean them getting eaten by South Korea because it's so much more economically advanced, and the North Korean people would realize that they've been lied to for decades and would probably kill their leadership. So it's wrong, I think, in many ways to put too much blame on outside forces for the division that still exists. And it also is problematic because sometimes when I talk to Koreans, they're like, oh, yes, if it was those darn foreigners, we Koreans should just work together and be nationalists and work together. And I'm like, well, that's great. But when you actually have to have government policies, are you going to try and look more like the Soviet Union or the United States, right? This again is a kind of anachronism. So is that they were not these Koreans today who have that view. They don't understand how in the 1940s and 50s there was this real question. We can't just be nationalists. We have to decide how our country is going to be organized. Should it be organized along communist lines or among Western liberal capitalistic lines, right? But again, there's this tendency. We have to be careful about this because I'm not picking on Koreans. This is just human tendency. We tend to take credit for our successes and blame others for our mistakes. And that's something we have to think about in the stories we tell about history. So here I've been trying to tell you stories about how people often look at the American and Korean past with the idea that you can think more deeply about the stories you want to tell and how you're going to be careful to tell a story that is accurate and complex. So the question for you is, what stories about the past do you want to tell or think should be told? And how will you make sure that those stories are accurate, complex, and useful?